This is the Burwell-Morgan Mill, and they started construction in 1782, and they were shipping grain by 1785. Somewhere in there they finished. It was built primarily by the Carter slaves and some Hessian POWs. This would have been the center of commerce for a little town like this, and in those days the roads didn't go from town to town to town, they went from mill to mill to mill. The laws in effect at the time were that the mill dam had to be wide enough for a wagon to get across it. They shipped the grain out of here largely by wagon to Alexandria, but some of it went to the Shenandoah River and went on flat-bottom boats to Harper's Ferry. And the boats themselves, when they got to Harper's Ferry, were taken apart and used in the buildings in the town. They can go in and look at the different beams and whatnot in the buildings and see all the cuts and see that came from these flat-bottom boats. There's a series of 4 gates between here and the dam, and we open them in sequence. That gives us our water, and we have the final gate inside the building. It starts the water wheel turning. And then once it starts turning, we grind it. We grind around 6 revolutions a minute. The miller in the old days ground about 10 revolutions because he wanted to get that grain through here and out. Well, the grain comes in, and they would have, depending upon the period, usually they would store it on this level in a large 10 by 10 by 10 bin. It would go down a chute and into the hopper right there at the top. And we had a gate right there in the chute, so we didn't overfill the hopper. And then it goes down into the eye of the stone, and from there it starts its course out. The first thing that happens, the stones are cut the same when they're both face up. When you turn them over, they're opposite. So you get a scissor action. And the first thing that happens when the grain gets in the stone, the grains get cut open. And then as they work their way out, they get slowly crushed and turned into the flour that we're interested in. And then there's a sweep on the outer edge of the stone that sweeps it around. And it goes into the chute and goes downstairs where it's either sifted or bolted. Today we're going to be making yellow cornmeal and yellow grits. And the grits are an extra process. We have a 2-piece screen that we use, and into the first screen goes the finer stuff, the cornmeal, and then there's a little board that separates the different screen sizes. The last one is an 1/8-inch mesh screen, and all the grits go in there along with the hulls and some cornmeal. So then we have to take that stuff outside, and we pour it in from a couple of pans back and forth in front of a fan to blow the chaff off. And from that, after we do that 2 or 3 times, then we'll have grits.
The Burwell-Morgan Mill was operated for much of the first half of the 20th century by a man named Ernest Alger. Mr. Alger was also the local postman. And one rainy day in March of 1948, he finished his postal route, came back to the mill to operate it in the afternoon, and found that the southwest wall of the mill, the gigantic 3-foot-thick stone wall, had collapsed, and unfortunately had collapsed in on the milling machinery. Now, Mr. Alger didn't throw in the towel immediately. He actually punched a big hole in the east wall so that he could drive a tractor through. And he attempted to operate the mill for the next few years using the diesel power of the tractor engine. Finally, though, he had had about enough of that and walked away from the whole thing in 1953. The mill then sat and essentially deteriorated, went to rack and ruin for the next 10 years, until it was purchased by Leo Bernstein, a man who already owned the Wayside Inn in Middletown, and he had the idea that he was going to turn the mill into a restaurant. That's when the Clark County Historical Association came into the picture. under the guise of Helen Bird, the president at that point. Mrs. Bird convinced Mr. Bernstein that this was an extremely valuable resource, a part of our heritage, and Mr. Bernstein donated the Burwell-Morgan Mill to the Clark County Historical Association. That took place in 1964, and the mill cost the association a grand total of $1. The mill that they got for $1 at that point was probably not worth an awful lot more. The stone walls all had to be repointed and in some places rebuilt. The roof of the structure had disappeared in large chunks at an earlier time, and rain had pretty much ruined much of the interior. In addition to that, of course, the mill machinery had been largely crushed by the stone wall that fell in on it some 15 years earlier. The mill dam that sequesters the water for the mill race was completely gone. And the mill race in many places had been used to water cattle and hogs. It had been filled with rubble in many places, so that had to be completely rebuilt also. They first engaged, the Historical Association engaged the services of John Campbell of Philadelphia. He brought along with him David Weddell and his son to act as overseers of the operation. And between Mr. Campbell and the Weddells, working with Richard Plater, who was a local man who had an abiding interest in restoring the mill, the operation was begun. And indeed, the question was, where do you start? So replacing the walls or repairing the walls really was the first thing to do. They also had some work to do on the foundation of the main Hearst frame, which is the frame that holds all of the milling machinery. That had sunk and deteriorated in many areas, and all of those foundations for the Hearst frame, for the milling machinery, had to be rebuilt. Obviously, the roof had to be replaced. And the first thing that they did when they went looking for the roof joists and most of the lumber that they repaired the inside of the building with was to look for good old lumber. They didn't want to just go to a lumber yard and buy 2x4s. So they went and looked in old mills, they looked at old barns, pretty much any structure that they could find that was on the verge of collapse or was itself going to rack and ruin, they got lumber from. After the roof was replaced, they could then start working on the interior structure. And we've calculated that somewhere around 50% of the major posts and beams holding up all of the interior structure had to be either extensively repaired or replaced. One of the neat things about this is that the craftsmanship involved was such that they duplicated the 18th century craftsmanship any place they possibly could. If you look at the floor joists, and you can see them from underneath on the first floor, you can see the original ones easily, and you can see the duplicates. The ones that they replaced, they even replicated the little bead that the original craftsman had put on those floor joists. The chamfers on the posts, we'll look at some of the posts in here. They're all chamfered. It was kind of a nice touch a craftsman would put on, even when he was building something like a mill. And those chamfers were duplicated when they had to replace some of these posts. The great water wheel, of course, being closest to the southwest wall that collapsed, was destroyed. The main shaft that water wheel and the drive wheel turn on was not destroyed. So they were able to salvage the main shaft. They also had to build most of the drive wheels. They were fortunate enough to find a mill in Middleburg, just a few miles from here, owned by the Jacksons. And they contacted the Jacksons, and they were very helpful. And since that mill was no longer operational, the Jacksons donated a good part of the machinery to the Burwell-Morgan Mill. The reason that worked is because the machinery of the Jackson Mill was of a similar vintage and very similar in configuration. We like to say that that original restoration in the 1960s, basically what they did was beg, borrow, and steal that machinery to make the thing go. It doesn't quite give them enough credit, though, because Richard Plater, Mr. Campbell, and the Weddells, and another local craftsman named Isaac Groves did tremendous work in rebuilding this machinery. Even given that, though, the average life of wooden milling machinery is generally only 25 or 30 years. So that by the time the 90s rolled around, the machinery that they had restored in the 1960s was in need of restoration again. And at that point, we brought in another millwright, a man by the name of Derek Ogden. He was English, and he came over here, and with an apprentice named Ben Hassett, the two of them undertook to completely rebuild the mill machinery to what they believe more closely resembled the 18th century configuration. They very closely studied what was here and what they believe in terms of the framework and everything really should have been here. And that took 6 years for them just to rebuild this machinery. I guess you could call that the second phase of the restoration. But that's not to take anything away from Mr. Groves and Mr. Plater and Mr. Campbell and Mr. Weddell, who got this mill operating back in the 60s. Toward the rear wall is the giant water wheel. The water wheel is 20 feet in diameter and 4 feet across. It's attached to the main drive shaft, which is 18 feet long, cut from the trunk of a single oak tree. They also, of course, had to rebuild the drive wheel, which is also on the main shaft. That drive wheel is 12 feet in diameter and composed of many, many parts, as you can see. One of the fascinating things about the drive wheel is that the spokes that you see on the drive wheel don't end at the great shaft. They go all the way through the shaft, giving the whole operation much more strength. All of the teeth, of course, had to be completely recut. Pretty much everything that you see here was either extensively repaired or replaced. On either side are the gears that drive the grindstones. This is the wallower gear. The wallower turns another great driver on the side, which turns the trundle gears. The trundle gears are on the main shaft, the steel shaft that actually turns the grindstones on the first floor. And one of the more remarkable things when you look at the size and scope of all of this equipment is that as you look around this building, you note we don't have big double garage doors. All of this had to be assembled right here on the spot. He did have a shop where he could build some of the smaller components, but for 6 years they spent the bulk of their time working in this basement, assembling it all. The people of Clark County, I think, owe a great debt of gratitude to those visionaries in the Clark County Historical Association back in the 60s who undertook to rescue this wonderful landmark. They wanted to restore the mill both as a testimony to Nathaniel Burwell and Daniel Morgan, who had the vision and foresight and wherewithal to start this back in the 1700s. But also, they saw this restoration as a testimony to the industriousness and ingenuity and craftsmanship of all of the men who worked on this building from 1785 all through the 19th century, well into the 20th, and then of course the way I think of this building is as a testimony also to the love that the people of Clark County had for this structure, so that without any government or foundation money, they were able to pull off restoration of what is a wonderful part of our heritage.